Hello, everybody. Welcome in. My name is Sydney Murray. I am the Conference and Communications Coordinator with Natural Start, and I am so excited to be here with you all to facilitate today's webinar as we get to hear from some very knowledgeable speakers on today's topic, which is all around exploring the for-profit versus nonprofit business models for nature-based preschools and programs. Today, you'll hear from two speakers, Rachel Larimore and David Catlin, who have been working together for years, advising countless individuals and organizations as they navigate both planning and operating nature-based education programs. Now, a couple of quick housekeeping notes for you to be aware of. This webinar is being recorded. Oh my gosh, did I hit record?
Yep, you're good.
Okay.
You did.
Thank you, Emily. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording as well as any related resources that we discuss and share today within the next week. Feel free to use the chat to share resources, share about your own experiences and observations, ask questions of our speakers. We simply ask that you are respectful to your fellow attendees and to our speakers who have so generously given their time to share with you today. Following presentations, we'll have time for Q&A. Feel free to drop those again in the chat. We might be able to wiggle them in throughout. And then we'll wrap up on time, I promise, at 3 o'clock. It's 4 o'clock my time is when we'll end. My wonderful colleagues, Christy and Emily, are providing tech support for our webinar today and will be monitoring the chat. So if you have anything that comes up, just go ahead and drop it in the chat and we'll try and address that as quickly as possible. All right, let's dig in. So as I said, we are very excited for today's webinar, especially because it's one that was inspired by conversations started in the Natural Start Alliance Google group, which if you haven't already joined, I highly recommend. This Google group is designed for you all, for professionals in nature-based early childhood education, to pose questions, share knowledge and resources, and really just support each other in any way that comes up. So Natural Start keeps a close eye on the Google group, and we noticed that a lot of questions around for-profit versus nonprofit program models keeps popping up. Questions and thoughts around things like the pros and cons and implications of choosing either the for-profit or nonprofit models. The process of merging organizations or programs that are of different legal statuses. Keeping the same program running, but wanting to change from nonprofit to for-profit or vice versa, or adding a partnership. What does that process entail? And then what are available resources for the different program models? All of these beautiful and wonderful and very important thoughts and questions keep resurfacing. So we wanted to leverage our webinar series as a platform to talk it out with two folks who have years and years of experience and expertise on the matter. Today, we have Rachel Larimore and David Catlin joining us to consider what might be important to consider for your program and what the implications of choosing one path over another might be. And spoiler, there is no one right answer for everyone. David and Rachel are simply here to lay out what the options are for you to assess for your own programs. They come ready to share a new resource they developed that I'm really excited to learn about myself. And they'll help you think through these questions. So providing a brief overview or a broad overview of what that resource is and taking your questions throughout and at the end. So with that, I will hand it over to Rachel and David.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for Sydney and all of Natural Start for having us. As always, I'm going to share here and hopefully you are seeing this non-winter mountain scene. Sorry, I should have stayed on season, Sydney. I didn't, but I was going for the path and then, but welcome everyone. We're glad to have you here. Dave and I are really excited to delve into this tiny little part of finding the best path for your program. So I realized the title, the subtitle perhaps is a little bit misleading in that this one decision of nonprofit versus for-profit is just one decision of many. It's an important one, and it has significant implications on other aspects of running a business. But of course, there's lots of factors that go into this. So we'll get into all of that in just a minute. Just very briefly, Sydney introduced us, but just a little bit about each of us. I am, again, Rachel Larimore. I'm coming to you from Michigan right now. So show you my hand, whichever preferred, if you like the front or back of your hand. I'm right here in the middle of the state. Of course, we have the UP up here. So I don't know with Zoom how it flips around. And Dave can show you where he grew up in Michigan. It always has to come back to Michigan. But I'm an education consultant with the company Samara Early Learning, and really help individuals that want to start a brand new nature-based school or program, or those that have a program and want to grow the nature-based approach. So a few of my books that you've probably seen floating around at different times recently. And then, yeah, I've been in the field a while. I've stopped giving specific years. I'm just using the plus now, so I don't feel too old. So that's very briefly who I am. Dave, who are you?
Well, I have actually been in the field longer. Um, and I don't shy away from it. I just lose track. Um, but over 40 years, certainly for me. And most of my time in the field, virtually all of it, has um, been with an emphasis on nature centers specifically. And as many of you are aware, and probably some of you less so, it was in nature centers where nature-based preschools first found their early roots. And so a lot of the ones that I've worked with have been in those kinds of settings. I currently come to you from Missouri. We don't use our hands. This probably works as well as anything, right? Where I'm in Southwest Missouri, Springfield. And but I did grow up in Michigan, went to Michigan State University, as the slide says there.
Go
And
green.
yeah. And have been go white, sorry, I missed my cue.
Thank you.
And I have worked mostly I've worked both in government and nonprofit arenas. So I spent almost 16 years with the National Audubon Society, which was at that time developing a number of new nature centers around the country, and does operate several nature-based preschools as well. And that's probably all that is really essential to know about me right now.
We'll share more later, I'm sure, of all sorts of fun things about each of us. So the plan for our time today is really a pretty short presentation, and then we're going to move into discussion. So the presentation, we're going to talk about what are the key differences between nonprofits and for-profit organizations, because there really are a few key, 6 or so key differences. So we'll talk about those. Then we'll also address a few additional considerations that actually came up in the question. So it was great. People were thinking about those options. Then we will talk about some questions to ask yourself when trying to decide between these two models. And then we're going to open it up for discussion. So then we'll stop sharing and we'll have a chance to really talk about your situation. And part of the reason that the presentation's shorter and the discussion time will be longer is a lot of this. The answer to the question of should I be a nonprofit or for-profit is it depends. What's the current situation? What are you hoping to accomplish? Who all's involved? How much decision making do you want, or do you want other people to have? And so if you hear us say, well, it depends, we're going to just probe you with more questions, because there isn't a simple answer, as Sydney said in the very beginning. Like, there's no right or wrong. There's no one clear path. But having said that, we would like to know who you are and sort of why you're here. Like, what brought you to this particular conversation about for-profit, nonprofit? So to help us answer that question, we have a poll for you. Our lovely Emily will help us. There you go, with the poll. So if you could answer which statement best describes your reason for joining the webinar today. So if you're planning a school or a program, you can interchange school with program. You're thinking about starting one someday. You currently have one, or maybe are reevaluating your model, or you don't have any plans. You just wanted to hang out with Dave and I. I ad-libbed that last question there a little bit.
I almost wrote that as one of the answers, Rachel. I just was afraid of the response.
Well, that's probably fair. All right. So it looks like actually there's a lot of folks that are, or a third of us in this currently have a program and are sort of reevaluating the business models, which I would just encourage you as we go through this and we talk about the differences to think about each of these factors. Is that part of why you're thinking about reevaluating? And just as we go, keep thinking about what is it that you're seeing as a barrier right now. And we'll talk more about that as we go. And then those of you that are just interested in this topic, kudos to you for being business nerds. So glad you're here. And then those of you thinking about starting or actively planning, hopefully this will help answer some of those questions as well, because this is an important step in the startup process. So, all right, I don't know. I closed the window. I hope that's closed for everyone. So let's dive in here. What are the differences? So we're going to explore this in a few different categories. We're going to first talk about the differences in terms of governance. So basically how the organization is governed and operates, like who's in charge. Profit distribution is a distinction between these two models. The process of establishing the organization. And we're using that term, I will use the term organization and business interchangeably. Sometimes I mean nonprofit, sometimes I mean for-profit. And this is maybe the chance to say, even if you're a nonprofit, it's still a business and you still want to make money, right? Just because it says nonprofit doesn't mean we're not trying to have a profit. And we'll get into that more, but sometimes that's a little misnomer. But so I'll use those terms interchangeably. We'll also talk about the difference in tax designation and implications of that, capital investment by stakeholders and outside folks. And so those are the big categories. So first, governance. What's the difference here? In a nonprofit, the nonprofit is governed by a board of directors. So this specific structure of the board, like how many people you have to have, and if there are specific roles you need to have, those will be determined by state laws. But an important thing to remember with being a nonprofit is you as an individual, if you're wanting to start this organization, you as an individual will not be the sole decision maker. Whereas a for-profit, depending on the business model you choose, and we're not going to explore all of those. We can talk about those later in the discussion time, but you might be a sole proprietor, you might actually be a sole proprietor LLC, you might be an S Corp, you might be a B Corp. There's different types of for-profit business models. But depending on whatever model you choose, you can be in those different models. You could potentially be the sole decision maker. Now you might have shareholders and have a system like that where there are going to be people who have opinions on how things run, but you could, in theory, be the sole decision maker. And why this? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to jump in with another way to look at this because we're talking about governance, but it's also, in a sense, ownership. Who owns this organization or business? In the case of a nonprofit, nobody does. And that's an important distinction. In fact, you could argue that the intent of the laws in the US, anyway, governing nonprofits, is that society owns the nonprofit. The for-profit, on the other hand, does have an owner. It could be just you, or as Rachel has touched on, it could be a partnership, it could be a group of people, but there is an owner for a for-profit entity.
Yep. And where this matters will particularly come up in terms of decision making. And we'll ask that question of you later. Do you want to make the decisions? And what is always a possibility if you decide to start a nonprofit as an individual and you're like, I'm going to take this on and passionate about this, there is always the chance that the board of directors might decide that you are no longer necessary or needed for the organization. In other words, they can fire your butt, right? And so you have to think about, is that important to you? If this is like, this is what I want to do until the day I retire, then that needs to be part of this conversation. Now, doesn't mean they're going to fire you, right? Doesn't mean that you can't be ensuring that you're selecting a board of directors that is supportive of the mission and the overall purpose. But that is always a possibility. And in fact, I have seen that with nature-based programs. Dave and I both have seen that happen where individuals have started as a nonprofit, but they started it as their passion project, had friends as the board of directors, thought it was a safe bet, and then later were let go. So that's the one caveat here. This is not an answer one way or the other. It's just a detail. All right. Another key difference is profit distribution. So in a nonprofit, there are still profits. As I said, we're still trying to make money, right? We still want to be in the black on the budget. Any of the profits, however, must be reinvested in the organization. Now, that doesn't mean you can't increase salaries, give bonuses for staff, right? But the investment has to come back to the organization and not just the top person, where it's the whole organization, right? Whereas a for-profit, the profits can be distributed to the business owners. And that's what Dave just said. Like the nonprofit isn't really owned by anyone other than, you could argue, the public. But the for-profit has specific owners. So the profits can be distributed to the owners themselves. Anything else on that, Dave?
Oh, that's good.
Fairly straightforward. All right. The other key difference is just the process for establishing an organization. The nonprofit process, there's going to be two ways you do this. First, by state. Also, I should apologize. I did see there's some folks that here from Canada, and so I know absolutely nothing about tax law in Canada. So that's my caveat on that. Maybe Dave does, but I have no clue. But there is some structure, right? So here, the process varies by state. So we would register through the state, and that is usually quick and straightforward. But then you also have to register with the federal government. And getting a 501c3 status, which is the nonprofit status designation from the Internal Revenue Service, can take as much as a year. So you might get, might register with the state, and it could even be a matter of days or weeks. And in some states, it may be moments. But it can take a lot longer for 501c3. And I have not talked with anyone lately that has applied. I would say the last I know of was like maybe a year ago, and they got it within 6 months. Dave, I don't know if you've heard any recent kind of rate of approval.
I think 3 to 6 months is more typical, but you're right, it can take as much as a year. In general, nonprofits are subject to more governmental regulation than for-profits. And that's basically because in the US, and I think this is true in Canada as well, the government has, they've set up this opportunity for organizations to create good for the public, but they want them to be transparent, and they want to make sure that they're not essentially being used as fronts for ways to make money. And so as a result, in general, becoming a nonprofit entails not only more paperwork up front, but typically more paperwork through the course of your operating time as well. I don't think we'd put this in there, but there's in the US, the Internal Revenue Service, in order for you to become a 501c3, which is a designation for a tax-free nonprofit, the IRS requires that you complete a form called the 1023. So Form 1023, you can go online and look at it. If you're contemplating becoming a nonprofit, I would suggest you do, because it's a multi-page form that asks a bunch of questions, including for you to project 3 years worth of what your revenues are going to be. And it's pretty detailed. That's one of the reasons this is a complex process, relatively speaking, compared to becoming a for-profit corporation, which you can often do just online, and depending on what state you're in.
Right. And I noticed, Christy, thank you for put the link in the chat. And then also There are links to the IRS forms in the 2-page PDF that we created with the summary differences of these two, which I think eventually we'll share in the chat as well. And then, as Dave said, the for-profit process is really quick. In fact, most of you, if you wanted to, if you had a name in mind for your business, you could log onto your state's website and be a business by the time I get to the end of the next slide. I mean, it's super fast, almost scary, but but it's really fast. All right. So the other key difference here is tax designation. And both of these things, the process for establishing and the tax designation, do have long-term implications, as Dave said, of how much paperwork we fill out down the road. For a nonprofit, once the organization is designated a 501c3, the earnings are tax exempt. So that's important just in filing taxes at the end of the year. Now, another point to Dave's point about this being a public, the public is supporting this. Those earnings and the tax documents at the end of the year are actually public record. So you can go now. In fact, I don't know, Dave, what's your favorite website to go and look up 990s and things, but you can go and look at other nonprofits and what they're and then look at their tax documents if you want to go and do that. Contributions. So the other part of being a nonprofit is contributions from donors may be tax deductible on their taxes. So if they give you a donation, they may be able to deduct that. And we say maybe because it partly depends on what their tax situation is, right? If they're itemizing deductions or not. I mean, there's just lots of factors. And also they can't be paying for a service. So it has to be truly a donation beyond just the service. I'll come back to that. For profit, you must pay income taxes on the earnings. Now, how you structure your for-profit in terms of business designation may improve the amount, depending on your perspective, how much you pay in taxes. In other words, if you're sole proprietor LLC, you're going to pay self-employment tax as part of that. But if you switch to become an S Corp, for example, you then as an individual would become an employee of the business, and the tax situation changes. So you receive a W-2 and then you have earnings beyond that or owner drop. So all this to say, talk to your accountant about that detail. And that really mostly comes back to how much money you're making in a year, and which type of business you should be. But in terms of tax designation for donations, a for-profit, those donations are not tax deductible. That doesn't mean you can't get money from other people, right? Someone could invest. That's what we mean by investors. That's the difference between a donor and an investor, really, is one gets tax credit for it and the other one doesn't. Now, and they're both going to have different expectations of what you're going to do with that money. But that's a separate thing. I will also say, while we're here about tax designation, when it comes to childcare, if you're running a school that is serving and the children are there as childcare, that is part of their childcare, the families can include that on their taxes. It's not a donation, so it's not going to be itemized as a donation, but instead as a childcare credit. And the childcare center doesn't have to be nonprofit or for-profit for that. And you may have gotten that request from families where they ask you for a form to show how much they've spent on childcare costs. Or you may not. Sometimes they can do it themselves. It all depends on the accountant's view of that. Can nonprofits have investors, especially for startups or hard times? Yeah, so they would be, yes. So there could be a loan investment where there's the agreement that we're repaying, or they could be true donations. So that comes back to what are the strings attached to the money. And that could be the same for profit. Even though they won't get a tax write-off for giving you money, they might just say, here's a gift. Maybe your grandparents are like, hey, I really believe in your business. Here's money. And they don't want you to repay them, or they might want you to repay. And then there would be an agreement on what that repayment plan is. hopefully that answers that question. Okay, so capital investment by outsiders is another difference. For nonprofit, capital is raised from donors who are typically expect a social return from their investment. So this goes to your question here about investments. That initial funding, this is often startup, but capital funds can be any time. But they usually expect to see some impact socially from their investment. For profits, the capital is raised from private investors who either receive equity or dividends as shareholders, or maybe it's just repayment and with or without interest, something like that. So we're going to come back to that fundraising question. That's a great one. Okay. Another key difference here, this is the kind of the final big difference, is about volunteers and then customers. So in a nonprofit, volunteers are generally willing to support a nonprofit, right, with their contributions of time. They're sort of seeing this as giving back and investing in this social good. For-profit, volunteers may be a little less willing to contribute their time to a for-profit business. It's like, well, why would I donate my time for you to make money?
One is
Right?
available to take your call. Please
Rather
leave
than
a
making
message after the tone.
a true impact socially. So in terms of the customer side of things, you're going to, in a nonprofit, you're going to have to satisfy the customers, the donors, volunteers, partners, and other stakeholders, right? Everybody. In a for-profit, you really only have to satisfy enough customers to pay your bills and the business owners, and maybe that's yourself. So it's not like you're having to please donors or other partners that you're working with. Now, good business is helping everyone, right? We just know that that's a better business model, but you don't have to in terms of customers. All right, so now we're going to shift into a few sort of unusual situations or things to consider, sort of three different models to think about. And I'm going to turn this over, I think, to Dave to take on. And it looks like, there we go. So I'll turn it over to you for thinking about fiscal models.
Right. Well, so we've sort of covered the general pros and cons of nonprofits versus for-profits. There's some hybrids, there's some other options that we would be neglectful if we didn't at least talk a little bit about. And that's what I wanted to touch on here. One is that if you're starting out and you're maybe not entirely sure of the direction you were going to head in, or perhaps you're in a hurry and you find it daunting that it might take you as much as a year to get an official designation in the U.S. from the Internal Revenue Service as a nonprofit. An option that's open to you is to become a program of an existing nonprofit. You find some other existing partner in your community, and you set up a relationship with them whereby they essentially channel nonprofit charitable dollars to you, and you become a part of them. Typically, that's temporary. Typically, most organizations that do that do it while they're waiting to get their own IRS 501c3 designation. But in theory, you could remain a program of an existing nonprofit. To do that, and this is called fiscal sponsorship. That's the term for this relationship. You have to have consistent missions. So for those of you contemplating a nature-based school, a nonprofit nature center, potentially even a church that had an education mission. There's probably a number of organizations that would have a mission that is consistent with yours, but it does need to be. You couldn't just sign on as a program for your brother-in-law's racquetball club. That wouldn't work. We advocate that the relationship be governed by a written agreement This usually involves getting an attorney involved to make sure that you have determined upfront, are you going to be paying them to be handling your funds, which is a pretty typical relationship. Fiscal sponsors typically will charge 5 or 10% of your overall income as a fee for the services they're providing you. And that needs to be covered in a written agreement. The advantages I indicated is that this is a faster way to get started than having to wait for an IRS designation. And as I indicated, it's generally temporary, but doesn't have to be. There's nothing that says it has to be temporary. The downside is that that the nonprofit, the official 501c3 nonprofit, becomes the official the official decision maker. So you are giving up some of your power, if you will, to have this relationship. It's one of the reasons that you want a contract with them that sort of governs what it's going to look like. Then we can go ahead and advance that slide, I think. Rachel?
Yeah, before we do that, I just want to draw, someone commented in the chat that they've done that with their community foundation. And I think that's a great example of a potential nonprofit that has similar, right, missions are consistent, but not exactly the same. You're not trying to be a nonprofit under another nonprofit nature-based program or school, right? But community foundation is a great example of that. Okay. Oh,
Yeah.
do we have a separate board? Do you want to answer that question?
Well, you're going to have an organization, even though you're a program of another of a nonprofit, of a 501c3 nonprofit. What I would recommend is that you incorporate in your state as a nonprofit. Remember, that's a pretty quick and easy process in most states. If you do that, I'm not aware of any states that that allow you to do that without having a board. So I think the short answer is yes, you will have a separate board for your program, even though you're not a 501c3. And you will still be a nonprofit corporation within your state. Typically, at least that's how I would advocate you do it. That way, you have an entity that can participate in a contract with this fiscal sponsor organization.
And also, I think one of the reasons to have a fiscal sponsor is, or one of the benefits is to build the capacity of your organization to be out on your own. And so having a separate board, building the capacity of the board with systems of how do you meet and what is the process for board involvement and reports to the board and engagement with the staff and so forth. I think that sets up that framework to just start with a board from the very beginning. So, all right. Nonprofit or for-profit arm.
Yeah, we had a number of questions here coming into this about well, we're running a business, but can we set up a nonprofit entity to take advantage of the fact that nonprofit entities can receive charitable dollars and foundation grants and that sort of thing. And the short answer to that is that you really can't, according to the IRS rules, and one that's called the private benefit rule, which you can Google if you want to see explanations of it. But basically, the IRS here in the US, and I suspect similar in Canada, wants to ensure that if you're a nonprofit, you are truly operating in the public interest. And that if you are a for-profit business, you're not using a nonprofit to help your business, if you will. So you can't set up a nonprofit, for instance, that receives dollars that you turn around and distribute to your students that need scholarships. That would be in all likelihood a violation of the private benefit rule. So I mean, you could set up a nonprofit if it served a broader purpose. In other words, you could set up a nonprofit that provided scholarships to low income potential students throughout your community, not only for your school but for others. There might be an opportunity to do that, but you can't really set up a wing that is going to benefit you as a for-profit business. And so in general, there's no real clean and simple hybrid models that mix the best components of both the nonprofit and the for-profit. Although we're going to touch on a few hybrid models here in a second that that I think will at least give you something to think about. One of those is a B corporation. And not every state has B corporations, but most of them do now, and others are adding this designation. A B corporation is basically a for-profit entity that's different than a standard for-profit entity in that typically a for-profit business is required to put the owners first. In other words, the stockholders, if there are stockholders, but whoever's invested in the business, they come first. Profit is king with most private companies, with all private companies except for B corporations. In a B corporation, while there are still owners, there are still stockholders in many cases, you can also consider what is best in terms of a social good. That becomes a legitimate consideration. And so there are a few nature-based schools that have decided to become B corporations. If that sounds interesting to you, the laws are a little bit different in every state, and you'll want to look at the option in your state. And you can start out as a regular business and later become a B corporation. The last bullet point on this slide mentions that there's something called a certified B Corp status. And that is actually separate from state designations. There is an organization called B Lab, which is itself a nonprofit, that looks at you as a business, looks at how you operate your business and the kind of public benefit it provides, and can certify you, give you a nonprofit certification that is recognized in the industry as a desirable designation for a business that wants to do more for the public good.
I would just add to this, one of the most famous B Corp corporations that people know of is Patagonia. It's probably the most famous one that people are aware of in terms of, committing to investing in social environmentals and meeting social and environmental standards. So not exactly a nature-based school, although we're trying to get them in that realm.
Actually, let me jump in. I was Googling this term earlier today, and I did I happened to run across at least one nature-based school that is a public benefit company in Colorado called the Nature School Cooperative in Aurora. I suspect there are others, but and I didn't ask them if I could advertise them here, but that's an example. They, under the laws of the state of Colorado, they are a B corporation there. So it's done.
I know of one. I won't name them, but a childcare program that will be opening here in Michigan, but is actually certified or I'm sorry, has designation as a B Corp through Delaware, because we don't have B Corp here in Michigan. So there's also that level of confusion. So you'll have to, if you are thinking about this will take some serious research and talking to an accountant in your state who can answer sort of what is state specific and what is the process. Eliza asked, are there tax benefits to being a B Corp? Not that I'm aware of. It's a social standard.
Right. They're still taxed as other private businesses are.
Yeah. Okay. We'll keep moving and then we'll come back to some of these questions. These are good questions. But a few questions to ask yourself before you make this final decision or to help you in making the decision. And we're going to have polls for each of these just out of curiosity. This is sort of gut reaction, right? You're not committed to this. But the first question, do you want to be the sole decision maker in your business or organization? Yes, that's important. Nah, or maybe it depends, right? I haven't decided yet. So there's a lot of undecided, and then mostly, yeah, it's important. So this goes back to thinking about, nonprofits will have a board of directors that we'd report to. So you wouldn't be the sole decision maker. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be really intentional about surrounding yourself with the right people that would support the mission and the organization and philosophy. So, there is board development that can happen, but that's an important distinction there. Okay. So we will move on to the next question then. Emily, I'm letting you deal with the poll things because I got a lot of windows happening. So the next question is, do you want to be the business owner or an employee? So basically at 5 o'clock, do you want to be able to be done and walk away and not stress? Or do you want to keep worrying about how you're going to pay people because your school isn't full yet? I'm making it dramatic because that's really what we mean is those worries, right? The responsibility, the challenges that come, that you can't pass the buck when you're a business owner. So some are there's 40% thinking about, yeah, I want to be the owner. And then definitely some that are like, nope, I want to be an employee. I want to go home. And then a whole lot, 40% that are still not sure, which is totally fair. And then the next question is, what's your timeline? How quickly do you want to be up and running? How quickly do you want to either open a new program or change your current model? So do you want to do this in 2024? Maybe 2025 or later, or you don't really have a timeline yet? A lot of you are thinking 60% are thinking this year. So as we talked about, nonprofits, to get the state designation can be quick, but federal may take a little bit longer. That doesn't mean you can't be a nonprofit, but it may mean, oh, do I want to look at fiscal sponsorship? Would that be faster? Just kind of contemplate, keep the timeline in your mind when you're thinking about the right choice for you. And then finally, how much do you want to rely on volunteer help? And volunteers, by the way, does not just mean someone to come in and teach in the classroom. Board of directors will be volunteers. Any kind of other support. Sometimes you might have bookkeeping support that you have a volunteer help you with some of that, or other behind the scenes work. So it doesn't have to just be in the classroom with children. Pretty overwhelming. It'd be nice to have volunteers, but not essential. So great. So those are just questions to be thinking about, and there will be more questions that come up. So just very briefly, we'll share with you, these are our contact information. You can find us both via email, the Samara Early Learning website. We also have encouraged you to take this quiz. It's super fast and it's fun. There's some fun gifts and things you can take, but wherever you are on your nature journey, you'll get a customized toolkit. And if you're thinking about starting a program, there are all sorts of great things in there, like guidelines for business plans and how to write those. And so all sorts of resources to check out. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. We had lots of great questions that came in, some very specific to what we've already discussed, some that sort of blur into some other questions. So I don't know. Let's see where to tackle some of these. I think the 99. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to start. I was writing some down as we were going and thinking about some responses. So one, you already addressed the question about can nonprofits have investors? So that was one I wrote down. If that answer didn't cover it, go ahead and mention that in the chat. The other question that jumped out for me is the question about, is a nonprofit able to hire for-profit businesses as teachers to avoid employment taxes? I suppose the short answer is yes. Technically, if you are contracting, you don't pay employment taxes. But the downside is, well, there's a couple of downsides. Number one is if you're hiring a for-profit firm to do your teaching in one way or another, they're going to be paying employees, and they're going to be paying employment taxes, and they're going to be passing that expense on to you regardless. So I don't really see the benefit there. The other challenges, and this is another follow-up question somebody asked, was a question about hiring contractors, which is essentially an individual person who's functioning as their own for-profit business. And the rules on who is a contractor and who is an employee, which are in the US are set up by the Internal Revenue Service, have always been pretty restrictive and have recently become more so. And so you had best check with your attorney before you contemplate hiring an independent contractor as your instructors, because in all likelihood they're actually going to pass the IRS test as employees, and you won't be able to do that. And Rachel, do you want to weigh in at all on that? Anything you want to add?
I mean, I think just sort of why is that? I mean, I think one of the reasons is the concern, right, of relying solely on contractors and not employees is the thought is that's a little bit of avoidance of paying benefits and some of the other things that are required for paying employees. And so that's why the IRS has limits on that. I mean, it's not just trying to be difficult. Maybe, but mostly, right, there's sort of reasoning. It sometimes is helpful to understand, well, why is that? What's the reasoning behind that?
But yeah, I would certainly be talking to my attorney before I tried to use instructors who were independent contractors and make sure that they're going to pass muster.
Mm-hmm. And most likely it will be responsibility, amount of time, and yeah, so definitely worth.
Well, if you're setting their hours, that's one of the tests.
Right.
If they have to show up at a particular time and be there for a particular length of time, that's one of the tests that separates and makes them employees rather than contractors. So, yeah, it's tempting to want to hire contractors, but it's legally fraught for somebody who's running a school that has a regular schedule. I'm looking here.
Yeah, another question that came in, not in the chat, but had come in before that I think is important for us to address is there a stigma? Do we think there's a stigma if you are a for-profit environmental business versus a nonprofit? I think there probably to some degree can be. And it may partly depend on the type of work you're doing. So if you are a school, childcare center, that sort of model, probably isn't much stigma because the world that's out there is heavily for profit in this childcare world, right? There's lots of for-profit business. So it may not have as much of a stigma. It doesn't mean it won't have any. So thinking about like what is the type of work you're doing? Are you supporting it? Just how are you structured that way? Now that also may be where, and this is why people go to thinking about being a B Corp, is because there's a little less stigma, and it's like, oh, you're trying to give back and have social and environmental impact in a positive way. And then we've also already talked about the fact that just because you're a nonprofit doesn't mean you're not making profit. So you could have a very profitable nonprofit that doesn't actually give back in the ways we might think and be environmentally sustainable, because environmental sustainability isn't necessarily a designation of or requirement of being a nonprofit. So yes, depends.
It wouldn't be one of the primary things I would worry about in making this decision, though. We've got only about 5 minutes left, Rachel, so I'm going to try to get through a couple of these quickly. Debbie wrote, I have a nonprofit. I'm a bit confused on how much I am to make decisions by myself and then report to the board. That's actually a whole new webinar on nonprofit governance. But the short answer is ultimately the board of directors is responsible for the organization's main decisions. In practice, a good board of directors delegates, especially all the day-to-day operational decisions, to the executive director or the equivalent. In other words, the lead paid staffer. But exactly how that relationship works and how you balance what the board decides and what's delegated to the director, that's a whole nother webinar on nonprofit governance. So we'll
Multiple webinars, perhaps.
yeah, we're right. We'll defer that.
The I have a 5-year-old after school program that's a mobile and flexible. I'm more interested in creating it as a training model. Don't think nonprofit works for me unless I am a program of another like-minded organization. Likely, I mean, part of it, I saw this in the comments, there's sort of this legacy element as well. So if you're really thinking about wanting to maintain a certain level of fidelity to your philosophy and approach, right, that it is the way you envision your school program should operate, you're also kind of wanting it to be yours, then yeah, for profit may make more sense. You could be a nonprofit. There's no reason that you couldn't offer a training model as a nonprofit, but some of those other factors, given what you've created and that you're trying to then share, that may not be as good a fit. There also was a question, I'll just quickly, about the co-op model, which I'm assuming you mean the question of co-op from a childcare perspective, which we don't, it's interesting, it aren't as common anymore, but still around, essentially where parents work to reduce their tuition. And that could be either nonprofit or for-profit. You could structure it either way.
Do you know if there are any implications for programs thinking about insurance as like a part of this nonprofit or for-profit decision? Like, is it easier or harder for programs to get insurance if because we've heard some programs are struggling to get insurance for this nature-based model. So wondering if one designation or the other would make a difference.
Cost-wise, on the surface for insurance for this activity would be the same. Where there might be differences of scale is if you're part of a bigger nonprofit organization, right? Where you already have an insurance policy and you're sort of expanding the program offerings. We see this, like Dave, with nature centers, right? That are adding a nature preschool into their mix. They already have insurance. They've maybe already had that discussion with insurance companies of this is what we do is we take kids out in the woods. So there may be reasons that it's easier, but in theory, there shouldn't be differences. But Dave, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree. I think neither of us is in the insurance business, but I would expect that insurance, the risks that an insurer is taking don't change that much whether you're a for-profit or a nonprofit. And so I wouldn't expect that it would make a big difference in your ability to find insurance or in what you'd pay for it.
I will say on the insurance question, because we do work with a lot of programs and we have had lots of conversations about insurance. One of the biggest things we've heard directly from insurance agents is if there's any way for a program to be licensed, they should be licensed. And that makes it a whole lot easier to get insurance. So,
okay, well, I'm so sorry. We have to wrap
yeah.
things. We just have 1 minute. There's so many comments and questions, and that just kind of goes to show how timely and relevant this topic is. I wish we could continue the conversation. TBD, maybe that'll be a follow-up webinar. But again, just wanted to send a big thank you to our speakers, David and Rachel, for sharing their vast knowledge and resources with us. As I mentioned, the webinar is recorded and we will have that available to you all within the next week, along with additional resources that we discussed today. just really quickly to share my screen, just a couple last minute announcements. We have our next webinar next month planned. Oops, can I click that screen? Oh, we're next. We're announcing the 2023 Blueberry Literary Award winners. We're so happy to continue our partnership with the Evanston Public Library, which highlights children's literature about nature connection and stewardship. And we'll provide a link in the chat just in a moment so you can register now. And then lastly, please stay in touch, especially with our 10th anniversary nature-based early learning conference coming up this summer, July 31st through August 3rd in Portland, Oregon. And we've got in-person and online attendance options. It's going to be amazing, and registration will be opening up sometime soon in March, so stay tuned. And that is all the time we have for today. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a marvelous rest of your day. And thanks again, David and Rachel.